Hola, my name is Millington and I'm a civil engineering lecturer at Cardiff University, where I'm developing undergraduate communication skills using a FlashLAM format. In this presentation, I will introduce why I'm doing it, give an overview of my student guidance, and then share research from the students who've experienced the process to report on their perceptions. My keywords are creative writing, storytelling, engineering education, collaborative learning, and climate action. So this slide gives an overview of my approach. The aim of the task was to improve basic writing skills, focusing on brevity for concise writing, correct grammar, clear structure, and overall coherence. This was the pot of gold that often remained out of reach for many students. So in addition to the writing of a lab report, I developed a FlashLAM task, the writing and reading aloud of short fictional works. They did this over 4 weeks, producing a first draft after my briefing in week 1, rewriting their stories to incorporate feedback from peers in week 2, and receiving presentation feedback from personal tutors in week 3. In week 4, they submitted a final draft and a reflection on their skills development. In developing the exercise, I've incorporated secondary benefits. Stories were extrapolated from research within the department. I introduced them to reflective practice. They had to use their imaginations and be creative. In specifying that the story be told by email, I hoped that they might improve their email etiquette, and the reading aloud to tutors served as a nice, low-risk first university presentation. I will go into more detail shortly, but before I do, the starting point is perhaps why am I doing it? So, communication skills are an accreditation requirement of our engineering degrees, but graduates are often not at the standard employers expect. I used to teach first year writing skills solely through the writing up of lab reports. In 2021 to 22, this attendance graph shows that they nearly all came to the in-class lab in week 5, then wrote up their procedures and results for review 2 weeks later in week 7, where there's a dip, and 2 weeks after that, we reviewed the rest, where there's an even bigger dip. After an opportunity to make further improvements, reports were submitted in week 12 for formative marking by peers and summative marking by me. However, as this graph shows, attendance was really not what I'd hoped. But who can blame them? How interesting is a lab report? How could I improve engagement and just get students to rewrite stuff? Which is essentially all I really want. During the second year residential field trip later that year, therefore, I ran a series of focus groups to explore ideas for storytelling as a pedagogic approach. I confirmed that all students, including those from overseas, have a secondary education qualification in their native language that includes reading, writing, speaking, and critiquing. Not surprisingly, I found that they like short format entertainment accessed on their mobile phones, such as YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, but that they also enjoy going to the cinema and watching a box set, i.e. they do like a good story. Therefore, they could do a FlashLAM and may be sold on its format to refresh and extend existing skills to the level we need. So, in 2022 to 23, I undertook a pilot with 6 fellow personal tutors and our 28 tutees. Although students were out of their comfort zone to begin with, they formed learning communities and qualitative feedback was positive, with comments such as it had been very beneficial. And in even an initially sceptical colleague, I was glad to have one on the pilot, was sold on the format, saying that they were really impressed. Quantitative results showed marginally higher lab report marks, not statistically meaningful but reassuring nonetheless, and interestingly higher module marks, suggesting that being the guinea pigs may have led to higher overall engagement. In any case, I rolled it out to the full cohort the following year, and it's now been completed by 3 cohorts of over 400 students. It's not compulsory due to the module architecture, but it is worth 2.5% per 40 credit module, so 1/120th of their first year. The coursework consists of 2 items, a story of unintended consequences written as a 500-word formal email, set in the future and extrapolated from civil engineering research, ideally their tutors or within the departments. The email format was introduced following the pilot to better enable immersive storytelling with its first-person point of view and to avoid the need for lengthy exposition. I based this concept on Lionel Shriver's prize-winning novel We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is written as a series of letters. Following the pilot, students also submit a reflection on the development of their writing and presentation skills. This is the element that is assessed as the real purpose of the task is to develop communication skills. The story writing is the vehicle to get us there, and I think it's a bit unfair and quite hard, in any case, to assess it. My guidance to students begins with a doom and gloom video from the Institution of Structural Engineers about the challenge of meeting net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. It's in the first person and is passionate and powerful, a long way from the language of a lab report. But it ends on a more helpful note that our future graduates, the students doing the flash slam, can help. From another iStruct presentation, I then share this graph that shows to do so, clever design will only get us so far, that we need new ideas to achieve most of the savings, and imagination is therefore vital. The iStruct are very keen for us to cultivate the imaginations of our undergraduates. So I've introduced to students what they're doing and why. Now I need to build their interest, and I start with a slide on futuristic fiction, asking them what they watched and what they liked best. Is it dystopian, like The Handmaid's Tale, or utopian, like The Circle? The difference essentially depend on which side the storyteller sits, but utopias can be lighter and might lack the opportunity for dramatic unintended consequences, so often become dystopian. A post-apocalyptic setting often makes for powerful drama and can be extremely dark, as in The Road. I asked them, have you seen it? Did you like it? What kind of story would you want to tell? I hopefully now have my students' attention, and I try to compound it by introducing the idea of mutual exchange, that writing futuristic fiction is a worthwhile exercise. The internet, the International Space Station, and electric vehicles all existed in science fiction long before they became a reality, but the gap can be particularly close. When Astounding Science Fiction published a short story on nuclear bombs in 1944, the FBI began an investigation, believing that there must be a spy at Los Alamos. But it wasn't the case. The STEM-informed author had just done their research properly. To compound interest further, I go on to tell them that engineers can write, despite what their experience of school might have been. It certainly put me off for a while. I start with the big three sci-fi writers of the 20th century, Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, and Robert A. Heinlein, all of whom were educated in STEM subjects. A more recent example is Ted Chiang, a computer science graduate whose father was a professor of mechanical engineering, and his work includes Stories of Your Life and others. A cover jacket quote on the 2020 edition states that Chiang puts science back into science fiction, so his writing no doubt draws on his education. But we shouldn't think our writing is limited to just sci-fi. Writers of mainstream fiction include J.M. Coetzee, who was the first author to win the Booker Prize twice, as well as the Nobel Prize for Literature. He has a degree in mathematics and early in his career worked as a computer programmer for IBM. The renowned American writer Kurt Vonnegut is also worthy of attention because he studied biochemistry and mechanical engineering. And this slide, as I'm an engineer, includes an opportunity for a spreadsheet. The books I've mentioned are all here and have been chosen because they've all been adapted for the screen. So what does the spreadsheet show us? Well, the review scores suggest that a good story is a good story, whether it's read or watched. They also show, perhaps, that the written format is actually enjoyed more. I say perhaps because, of course, we're not comparing the same audiences. I'm giving students a lesson on lies, damn lies, and statistics to promote an opinion. However, I do hope it encourages the students to read more. I heart spreadsheets and I heart books. To improve one's writing, one must read, so some specific recommendations I included here. First is the novella Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, in which the protagonist wakes one morning to find himself being turned into an enormous insect. We experience the situation as it unfolds, but we're not told why. It's unnecessary exposition, not the story. I also provide a link to prize-winning flash fiction. Tattoo Man by Amanda Marples, because it includes the judges' comments that might guide my students in their creative writing. And in the briefing, I read my story Detached, which was a top scorer at a Bristol Festival of Literature Flash Slam a few years ago. The content is not what they'd expect. An adult-themed comedy developed from a short story I wrote on my creative writing MA, and it has nothing to do with engineering. But it helps break the ice and free their imaginations. So there's a lot of guidance on writing fiction on the internet, but a good starting point is structure. All writing needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. But I recommend the use of an abridged version of Freytag's Pyramid for short stories. The email format avoids the need for lengthy exposition, as I've said, and we can begin with the inciting incident, build drama with rising action, and finish pretty much with the climax. I include a few story suggestions in my student briefing. For example, this one from my colleague's self-healing concrete research. The inciting incident could be an opening line of, "We're being attacked." The rising action could be our heroic storyteller checking the chemical store, and the climax, "It's empty, but there's a gigantic superworm," ends the email with drama. I also give students 6 steps for flash fiction writing, all of which are valuable. They offer strong imagery, sticking to one moment and aiming for a surprise. The email format means they should be writing in the first person, but they should avoid too many characters, and the email title is an important detail not to miss too. According to Booker, there are only 7 plots for short fiction. I recommend keeping it simple. For example, a tragedy or a comedy. Of more use, I think, are Vonnegut's 8 rules for creative writing. He was mentioned earlier as a successful writer from a STEM background, and it's likely that his scientific thinking helped formulate them. Each of these rules are important, particularly number 5 for short works, to start as close to the end as possible. Guidance for the workshops were developed with the help of a colleague in the School of English, Communication and Philosophy, who found the expectation for engagement needs to be clear. Peer feedback may be contradictory, so students might need to be judicious in deciding who they agree with and what they take on board. Personal tutors will only give feedback on presentation skills, as that's where, as engineers, we're all able to comment. But of real importance here, though, are the ethics. Students must be able to write freely, without prejudice, so each group is required to respect one another's work and not share it further. I developed proformas following the pilot, and in the peer critiquing proforma, I asked students to comment on what they thought was good, to open with praise, and then on structure, coherence, brevity, and grammar, highlighting my pot of gold for what's important in written communication. In reading their stories, they should focus on this list: pace, volume, tone, emphasis, punctuation, eye contact, body language, and expression. In completing my senior fellowship of the Higher Education Academy at Cardiff, I was made more aware of inclusivity and identified an option to make the task more accessible for our neurodiverse students following the first run. My concept was for it to be completed in tutor groups of typically 4 students, but there's no reason, so long as they read one another's work, give, receive, and act on feedback, that critiquing can't be undertaken in smaller groups or with friends. They can also present in smaller groups or record a presentation if they are particularly anxious about this aspect. 2 cohorts have had these options so far, and while some have chosen the smaller groups, they have all engaged with live presentations to their full tutor group. I introduced the reflective element following the pilot, and the kind of thing I'm looking for could be that when using Microsoft Word's read aloud function, the vocabulary sounded overcomplicated and made it hard to follow, so they used simpler language. They would then include the paragraph before and after to show drafts and redrafts, and do this for a few different types of improvements to show the breadth of their development. Those who also acknowledge how their learning will feed forward into their future written work will earn the best marks. And now we move on to part 3, the student questionnaires. To give some context, the coursework leads to module marks but wasn't compulsory. So while not all students submitted, 251 students from the 3 cohorts engaged in the coursework, completed my questionnaire while we were on a field trip a few months after the task, and gave consent to inclusion in this research. I asked 10 questions, 7 on a Likert scale, and 3 as free text. And the results showed that over 70% agreed that their writing, presentation, and reflection skills had improved as a result of completing the FlashLab exercise. Which is great, but I would expect to see 100% if they fully engage with the process. I have attendance data and will attempt to see if there's a correlation. In terms of how hard they found the story writing, reading, and reflection, survey responses suggest around 60% found it easy, which I think means I've pitched it at about the right level. Interestingly, they found the reading of their stories to personal tutors slightly easier than the other bits, when I'd have thought presenting would be more of a challenge. And more than half enjoyed writing fiction, workshopping it with their peers, and reading it to their tutors, which is nice for a bunch of engineers. It isn't surprising that some didn't enjoy it. As I said, they're nearly all out of their comfort zone to begin. However, when you look at those who gave a 7 to 10 response, the sentiments were stronger, and it seems that those who enjoyed it really did enjoy it. Last summer, I had an intern, Shana Alatrushi, who was part of Cohort 1, who undertook an in vivo analysis of the qualitative results of the first 2 cohorts. And she found that what students enjoyed most was the opportunity for creativity and imagination, with a few other nice-to-see comments coming out, such as personal growth, peer interaction, and collaboration. What they didn't like, though, was the story format. I had quite a few saying that they struggled with writing it as an email. There were also frustrations with time management that I need to dig into a bit further, but I think perhaps that some were spending more time on it than I'd anticipated because they'd become so absorbed. And the take-home message from their ideas for improvement was the need to spend more time on their presentation skills. It was only a secondary benefit when I developed the task, but I asked them to consider it in their first workshop this year. Their feedback for guidance needs more exploring. Given her experience, my intern suggested that attendance, or lack thereof, may be a factor for the students commenting on this. And finally, my conclusions. FlashLab is a suitable vehicle to develop writing skills, and my format has additional secondary benefits which help give graduates the attributes they need. I hope to include the full results from Cohort 3 in the paper that follows, but I'm also very keen to collaborate with others looking to improve their students' communication skills with this FlashLab format. I think there's opportunities to tailor my approach for other STEM disciplines, perhaps with a focus on the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So please send an email if you're interested or if you have any questions. Muchas gracias y chao.